On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book and the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for our 2023 celebration of Women's History Month. Our speaker is Miki Pfeffer, and her subject is Writing Women at the Fair in New Orleans, 1884 to 85. In early March 1885, the Women's Department at the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition formally opened in New Orleans. Women from all over the country visited the exhibits and shared ideas about rights and training and equal pay for equal work. A favorite area in the department was the literary section. It was filled with books, newspapers, and journals written by women. Pfeffer will highlight, among other things, this special collection and discuss the importance of the ladies of the press, who gave women an international audience. Miki Pfeffer is an independent scholar who studies women's literary and social history, especially 19th and early 20th century women in the South. Her books are Southern Ladies and Suffragists, Julia Ward Howe, and Women's Rights at the 1884 New Orleans World's Fair, and A New Orleans Author in Mark Twain's Court, Letters from Grace King's New England Sojourns. Pfeffer has written on these subjects for scholarly journals and for collections of essays, and has presented at scholarly conferences to various local groups and Mark Twain venues. She earned a master's in English literature and a Ph.D. in urban history, both from the University of New Orleans. Currently, she continues to transcribe all correspondence in the Grace King papers and has begun investigating the career of Ruth McInerney Stewart, who wrote in the same era as King. Here now is Miki Pfeffer.
Thanks to the State Library for this opportunity to talk about women and the Women's Department at the Cotton Centennial Exposition for this Women's History Month, and to tell you about the writing women who were in New Orleans in 1884-85. Once upon a time in New Orleans, women came from all over the country for the first time in the South to exchange ideas, accomplishments, and needs. These spirited women have their say in my book, Southern Ladies and Suffragists. On a Sunday afternoon in March 1885, the Women's Department formally opened in the space in front of the Women's Christian Temperance Union Pavilion. Franklin C. Moorhead, who was the Commissioner General of the fair, said it was the first chance for women to thoroughly display her capacity. And he declared himself a women's rights man, to much applause from the women, and declared that women should receive the same pay for the same work. That sounds familiar. Howe, Julia Ward Howe, was the president of the Women's Department. She was a Bostonian woman who had been selected to lead the Women's Department. And she gestured around to all the exhibits that were around the women gathered there and talked about how important women's work was. And she asked what women had invented and talked about the various inventions that were gathered in a special department. She talked about how women were all under one flag now after having been separated by Civil War and Reconstruction. They were anxious to come together and join again. And she declared that women had worked together well to show the value of women's work. The Women's Department was located in the Government Estates building on the second floor along one wall of a 9 or 11 acre building. They had 22,500 feet to work with. When they arrived, as women came in, the department wasn't ready. There was no floor. The ceiling was leaking, but they worked together to do what they could to put the department together so that it could be ready by March when they formally opened. There were also special sections, books, inventions, science, and organizations had separate departments, as did the states. Each state had a separate space within the Women's Department to show what was brought. And also on the second floor, they shared the space with the colored department, the first ever colored department at a fair, and an educational department, large educational department. The official title of the World's Fair was the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition. There were huge buildings. The main building covered 33 acres. And as I said, the government and states building was separate. It covered 9 to 11 acres. The icon of the fair was the Horticultural Hall, which is where Audubon Park Zoo is now. The space that this fair took place on was all of Audubon Park. And the Horticultural Hall was funded by the city of New Orleans and was the only permanent building. And it stayed permanent until 1915 when a hurricane took it down. The city was attempting to boost its economy with the fair, to redeem its port, and to open trade routes, especially to the South, and to diversify industry, and to show that there was a new South, one of progress. So the women's department was part of the show of that progress. They were encouraging women to be progressive in a pretty conservative area. Julia Ward Howe was chosen because she was a celebrity. Her celebrity rested upon her verses for the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Everyone is familiar with that. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Moorhead, the Commissioner General, had found her at the Boston Mechanics Institute in 1883. He was impressed with what she had created in that department. So he invited her to head the one in New Orleans, which was not well received by the Southern women because they thought a local woman should head the department. But she was not only a famous woman because of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. She was also a poet. She wrote travel literature. She wrote essays. So she was very much an activist for all advancement for women and for suffrage too, which Southern women had not taken to just yet. Howe could draw women, the promoters of the department thought. And well, she did. And she could fend off local jealousy and resentment, the promoters thought, which also kind of insulted the Southern women because they thought that they could manage just well. She was criticized often, but she did have a marked ability and a force of character. She managed to whip the department together, and it became a success with the help of other women as well. Her local counterpart was Caroline Walmsley of the Christian Women's Exchange. The exchange became the local headquarters for all of the exhibits from across the country that were being sent to New Orleans to show in the department. Everything from a pincushion to a railroad car seat. And Walmsley, along with Howe, encouraged women across the country. They stored the exhibits until the department was ready and supplied day-to-day management to watch out for the exhibits that states brought. And they received a center display in the department as a result. They were an important part of New Orleans women's benevolence. They had raised $44,000 that year for women who needed work by selling their jellies and jams and handwork and inheritances, inherited furniture and such. Those women now run the Herman Grima House. Walmsley made local decisions. For example, the colored ladies exposition committee came to her wanting to show in the women's department, and she provided $250 for them to set up. They ended up in the colored department rather than in the women's department. That double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois later talked about, where you're confronted with either your gender or your race. So they ended up there. The male state commissioners or governors appointed a lady commissioner for each state. This is Ohio's exhibit. And each woman in a state collected exhibits and inventions, documents of expanded roles in management and settlement houses, etc. And also things like taxidermy, furriers, all kinds of women who were doing unusual jobs, because one of the reasons for being here was also to show other women, visitors, what women could do, to give them an idea about what they could do in their lives, because it was a needy time. Women needed to find work either in the home or elsewhere. Julia Ward Howe wanted 100 journalists to come and tell the story of the women's department. And they were very fortunate to have a local woman owning the Daily Picayune. Eliza Nicholson, from 1876 to 1896, was owner and publisher of a daily newspaper. And she hired a number of women journalists, one of whom was Catherine Cole, that was her pen name, who wrote every day about the women's department. And she also wrote a weekly column about what women were finding, what kind of work they were finding, and what organizations were doing all over the country to keep women in New Orleans informed and in the area, because the Daily Picayune had a large circulation. And other women came as well. Lots of journalists came to report on the women's department. So there was not only local coverage, but also national coverage. And there were several women who were assigned to an office at the fair every day, Catherine Cole being one of them for the Daily Picayune. They wrote up all the famous women who came. Frances Willard, some names are not familiar now, but Frances Willard on the far left was head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. By the time she came, the Temperance Union was also looking at suffrage to make a difference in trying to get people to drink less. Susan B. Anthony came, stayed 2 weeks. She was very popular. And her vice president of the National Women's Suffrage Association came with her, May Wright Sewell. They talked to all kinds of groups while they were in New Orleans. It was the first time that a suffrage leader had been able to talk to women in the Gulf states. So they took advantage of that, as did Julia Ward Howe, who was from another wing of the Suffrage Association at that time, a more slightly conservative wing. Susan B. Anthony was shooting for a national law. Julia Ward Howe and her group were trying to get laws passed in states so that women could vote. So Clara Barton also was here for a short time. And of course, Clara Barton was the American Red Cross, started in 1881. And Howe and Maud Howe, her daughter, was with her. and a woman who was quite famous for her newspaper, Frank Leslie's Illustrated Journal, a weekly, and she hired a lot of Southern women as well. So these women were written up and had a good opportunity to speak for others. A special department was the literary department. Maud Howe came with her mother, Julia Ward Howe, and took on the role of leading the literary department. She pressured the lady commissioners who had come from various states to let her display the books that they had brought that had been written by women all in one place, because she felt they would make a greater impression, and it did. So, but to appease the women who were sometimes reluctant to turn over the books because it took a little bit from their exhibits, she shelved the books by state. She gathered over 1,400 books written by women and journals and newspapers. She wrote authors and editors and publishers to get them to send more books for her library there. And she also created a place of repose so that women could gather and share their ideas. One of the most important parts of the women's department was as a forum to share ideas, to learn about what people around the country were doing and writing and saying, debating and discussing and sharing ideas. 1,400 books by women, newspapers and journals, edited or owned by women, were gathered in Maud Howe's literary department. Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island had most of the recognizable book titles that you would know, from Louisa May Alcott to Harriet Beecher Stowe, and some foreign writers too, like George Sand. Louisiana had 24 books. Several of them were religious, by the Sisters of Mercy. The woman who owned the Picayune was also a poet, writing under the name Pearl Rivers, and her works were there, and also Frank Leslie's Illustrated Journal, the woman who I talked about having hired a lot of women writers. At the end of the fair, Maud Howe donated 800 of those books to the Southern Art Union in New Orleans. The Southern Art Union already had 4,000 volumes that they circulated among borrowers, and they claimed that they were the only library lending modern, current literature. On the last day of the fair, May 30th, the women gathered again in the literary department this time, what the Times Democrat newspaper in New Orleans called the most attractive feature of the women's department. Maud called this collection this beautiful sisterhood of books. And she felt that the collection would increase over time. She donated these 800 books, and in each was a book plate with these words: presented to the Southern Art Union Library in the name of women writers of the United States by Maud Howe. The book in the center, called Orphanage Record, is one that is in the library of Newcomb College now, and it has that book plate in it. Also left as a book from the fair was the Christian Women's Exchange cookbook. The Creole Cookery was developed during the fair and was for sale in the women's department, and it was a legacy from the department as well. And Julia Ward Howe's report and catalog of the women's department is a treasure of the whole experience from each lady commissioner of various states. And it's lodged in Tulane's library as well. And that is where are listed all of the books, the 1,400 books that were in the library. You can go there, or you can visit a digital recreation of the literary department if you care to, being created by Newcomb College Institute at Tulane by Googling this beautiful sisterhood of books. Late in the time of the fair, it ran from December 1884 to end of May 1885. Late in that, a press department was actually created. It was promised earlier by Julia Ward Howe, but it didn't come to pass because the money that was promised to the women's department didn't materialize, so she wasn't able to do a press department. But the acting director of the fair created a press room in the main building, and out of that, a Women's National Press Association was formed with Eliza Nicholson from the Daily Picayune as its president. And that association was the first of its kind and continued after the fair. What else? Though you can't create a straight line from the women's department to certain activities and results, one can trust that all of the debate and discussion about higher education that went on during the fair inspired the founding of Newcomb College by Josephine Newcomb the next year. Also, clubs expanded. The department was also pushing for training for new jobs for women, and new jobs were emerging. They were pushing for activism, and the existing women's clubs expanded and others were formed. Women also gained ideas for curing or solving social ills, and most of all, suffrage. And Caroline Merrick from New Orleans was the only avowed suffragist at the time. And later, in 1892, she and several other of her friends created the first suffrage club in New Orleans in 1892, Portia. This picture of the Women's Suffrage Party of Louisiana came later. And I think that these women laid the groundwork for women, even in the 50s in the area, to be more receptive to suffrage activity. But they did not get equal pay for equal work. And that was the phrase that was being used during the women's department: equal pay for equal work 138 years ago. And we're still working on that. Individual careers during the time were also begun or enhanced. Elizabeth Beaslin worked at the Times Democrat as the literary columnist, and she went on to Cosmopolitan in New York. And she is somewhat famous for doing the same thing that Nellie Bly did in trying to beat the Around the World in 80 Days. She went in the opposite direction from Nellie Bly and lost out by a day or so. So Nellie Bly, a journalist in New York, got more fame from that. But Elizabeth Beaslin had a successful career after having left the local paper in New Orleans. Belle Kearney was so impressed with hearing Julia Ward Howe lecture to mixed audiences, that would be men and women at the time, unusual for the time, that she went on to be a spokesperson in Mississippi for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Mary Ashley Townsend was already a poet in New Orleans, writing as the Sariffa, X-A-R-I-F-F-A. She wrote celebratory poetry. She wrote the opening poetry for the Cotton Centennial on its opening day, and also for the Women's Department on its opening day. Only she didn't read the poetry. She was either too shy or too proper for the time. She allowed a man to read it instead. Grace King, a writer from New Orleans who went on to some fame as a fiction writer and a historian, her career came directly out of the Cotton Centennial. Grace King's writing career came directly as a result of Julia Ward Howe and editors being in New Orleans, because she met them and had an opportunity to be challenged and to be mentored. She joined a club that Julia Ward Howe created, a literary club, where she learned to write, read, and prepare her work for publishing. And then she met two editors, one who challenged her to write stories and the other who helped place those stories. And she also met Mark Twain through her mentor, Charles Dudley Warner. I continue to transcribe Grace King's letters. I already have a book out of her letters to Mark Twain and his family. They had a 20-year friendship, and she would not have had a career had it not been for the Cotton Centennial Exposition and the opportunities that it brought for women who wanted to write, who were writing, and who wanted to move ahead and find their own way. Women made a difference in 1885 and beyond. I hope that hearing about these active and writing women inspires you to learn more. Thank you for your attention.